Okay, so this is a nice review paper, and I in fact feel bad to reduce it to one brief podcast, but then you can always follow up. So I'll make some main points, most salient of the points from here. It's called Navigating the Continuum Between Adaptation and Maladaptation. As we said, adaptation has happened throughout human history, even going before before the Holocene. Humans have migrated across the planet to deal with climate change, and through the Holocene in terms of agriculture and so on. So what is adaptation and what is maladaptation? What may be adaptation now may become maladaptation with evolving risks and so on. But when you plan adaptation and invest in adaptation, you have to be mindful of what is adaptation and what and if and when it may become maladaptation. So this is about navigating this continuum between adaptation and maladaptation. Adaptation is increasing across all sectors globally. Some can argue it's not fast enough, yet the effectiveness of adaptation is inadequate and examples of maladaptation are increasing. To reduce the risks of maladaptation, we propose the framework Navigating the Adaptation Maladaptation Continuum, or NAM. This framework is composed of 6 criteria relating to outcomes of adaptation for ecosystems, the climate in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and social systems, so transformational potential can be exploited, but also equity related outcomes for low income populations, women and girls, and marginalized ethnic groups. We apply the NAM framework to a set of representative adaptation options, showing that considerable variation exists in the potential for adaptation or the risk of maladaptation. We suggest that decision makers assess adaptation interventions against the NAM framework criteria and prioritize responses that reduce the risk of maladaptation. You want to adapt and be prepared for future risks and go beyond managing crises and build resilience, but then also constantly keep track of the uncertainties and the evolving risks to also keep an eye on potential maladaptations, right? Oops, this quality of this figure is a bit murky, but anyway, I'll just plow through it. I expanded a bit too much, I guess. So here is the maladaptation end, and this is the adaptation end, and we are looking at equity-based criteria, system level criteria, and the filters which are not applicable to anyone outside a restricted case study, and the number of people covered goes towards applicable to most people in the world, that is greater than 5 billion people out of the total, so that's defined as most. So here you have adaptation with negative consequences that increase the climate vulnerability of a system, sector, or group, that shift vulnerability or exposure, or that erode sustainable development now or in the future. That's a tall order, but nonetheless we have to be as prepared as possible to avoid maladaptation. Adaptation is something that moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities, that is, that reduces climate risk by either reducing vulnerability or exposure to climate change related impacts. Okay, so I won't read all the details, but again, adaptation outcomes are looked at in this continuum on ecosystems and ecosystem services, greenhouse gas emissions as we talked about, so mitigation, adaptation included in there, systemic change which does not facilitate or unintendedly inhibits on this end and contributes to a broad by going beyond tackling the source of a particular risk on this end. Low income groups you want to be included, protected, social networks, safety networks given. Women and girls, we've talked about extensively how about involving women in decision making actually enhances resilience and social cohesion and so on. And educating girls is a most important contraceptive in terms of reducing population and fertility rates. Not related directly to climate change, but nonetheless very relevant. Marginalized ethnic groups. So again, here you are talking about increasing social vulnerability and reducing adaptive capacity or causing unintended harm on the maladaptation scale, or decreasing social vulnerability, building adaptive capacity, or beneficial to other things, co-benefits on this end of adaptation. This is again big table. I could have cut it into two, but it's not easy because of the way it's organized. Nonetheless, evidence across IPCC Working Group 2 AR6 for a new conceptualization of adaptation supporting alternative approaches when tracking adaptation. Okay, so that's the Working Group 2 on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, looking at sectoral and regional chapters. So it had terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, ocean and coastal ecosystems, water, food, cities, health, poverty, Africa, Asia, Australasia, Central and South America, Europe, North America and small islands. And you had here on this axis difficulties of tracking adaptation, advantages arising from an interdisciplinary approach that stresses ancillary and co-benefits of adaptation, synergies and trade-offs. I have a whole set of podcasts on IPCC as well that you can follow up based on water and food. Ingredients of successful adaptation are listed here again for each of these key topics, and I'm not going to read all of those, not even as an example. Maybe we should do just, let's say, water. So key topic water, difficulties of tracking adaptation, consensus on effectiveness assessment methods is the challenge in terms of tracking adaptation. Advantages arising, positive adaptation outcomes often align with mitigation co-benefits, and water adaptation always helps food, energy, health, and even transportation as well in terms of co-benefits. Ingredients of successful adaptation, contextual nature and boundary conditions determine the success of adaptation outcomes. Indigenous peoples are often best placed to enact successful adaptation. So you get the sense of how IPCC looked across these dimensions. Another more complicated picture here, looking at the location of adaptation options along the adaptation-maladaptation continuum, contributing to potentially successful adaptation or the risk of maladaptation. So results are shown as mean scores for individual assessment criteria per adaptation response, colored circles, as well as mean scores across all 6 assessment criteria and at the level of RKRs. Risk, I just had RKR remembering, and then risk knowledge, what was it? This is the tricky thing about teaching for the first time, that you don't always remember key. So representative key risks, representative key risks, RKRs. Sorry about that. Okay, where was I? La la la. So maladaptation, so location of adaptation options along the adaptation-maladaptation continuum, contributing to potentially successful adaptation or the risk of maladaptation. Results are shown here at the level of representative key risks of the IPCC WG2, their nomenclature used here. Okay, let's just quickly look at this complicated, very complicated picture. You are looking at representative key risks ranging from risk to low-lying coastal socio-ecological systems, risk to terrestrial and ocean ecosystems, risk to human health, food security, water security, peace, and human mobility, with adaptation options ranging from coastal accommodation, coastal infrastructure, you have spatial planning, building codes, access to healthcare, disaster early warnings, which is something I always like, diets and food waste, water capture and storage, water supply and distribution, seasonal and temporary mobility, governance, cooperation, permanent migration or dislocation, and various filters are here used with details provided in terms of range of scores and average scores across assessment criteria, average scores at the RKR level or the representative key risk level. So complicated. successful adaptation in this direction, risk of maladaptation in this direction, and assessment criteria with various potential contribution to adaptation to climate change. Obviously, I couldn't, you can spend a whole hour discussing this figure itself. Scoring system for the filters could reduce the exposure or vulnerability for most people in the world, so that's greater than 5 billion. Grayish color, smaller circle, could reduce the exposure and vulnerability of some, so less than 5 billion. And smaller circle with lighter color could reduce exposure or vulnerability of specific groups, that is less than 1 billion. And empty circle, very small one, not applicable to anyone outside a restricted case study that is looked at. So you can see the continuum of the adaptation, maladaptation space with system level considerations for ecosystems, ecosystem services, climate system including greenhouse gas emissions, social system, transformative potential, transformational adaptation is something we have looked at. You can follow up on the podcast, and equity related considerations, low income populations, women and girls, and marginalized ethnic groups. So you can see adaptation options and potential for contribution to adaptation to climate change ranging to maladaptation. Okay, so multiple dimensions and criteria are to be considered. So scholars acknowledge the challenge of lacking consensus on how adaptation can be tracked. So this itself is a caveat we read in the previous podcast as well on global status of coastal adaptation. So here they have done it in 2 steps. The first step indicates the application scope, estimating the number of people for whom vulnerability or exposure can potentially be decreased using an adaptation option. Second step consists of applying the 6 assessment criteria that we looked at, which can be grouped into 2 categories: system level considerations and considerations allow us to understand and distribution effects of an adaptation option on systems relevant for adaptation, and sustainable development, that is whether an adaptation option was shown to benefit, have no effect on, or worsen the situation of relevant systems in the past, or is likely to benefit, have no effect, or worsen the situation of relevant systems in the future. The system considerations include, of course, ecosystem and ecosystem services, climate system, social system, equity-related considerations, and such. Very quick summary I am providing, jumping all the details, but it's an excellent way of analyzing the and navigating the maladaptation adaptation continuum. What do they conclude? We offer the NAM framework to help assess progress with regard to adaptation and maladaptation practices. The framework which we looked at provides adaptation researchers, practitioners, and funders with a composite assessment approach to enable better anticipation of adaptation outcomes and or the risks for counterproductive effects, avoiding maladaptations. The continuum approach mirrors the reality of adaptation implementation, going beyond suggesting interventions as good or bad, and instead highlighting how interventions can, in complex ways, have mixed outcomes based on a number of assessment criteria. This is very critical to look at the dimensions of adaptation. As figure 2 highlights for cross case analysis, the location of each adaptation response on the continuum is captured through the outcomes on ecosystems and ecosystem services, the climate, greenhouse gas emissions, social system, and as well as normatively equity related aspects we looked at, such as outcomes on low income populations, women and girls, marginalized ethnic groups. This method underscores an ancillary benefits, co-benefits, and synergies of adaptation that are seen as decisive in reaching local or broader societal goals such as sustainable development goals. We talked about the need to synergize adaptation, mitigation, sustainable development goals, nationally determined contributions, and economic development goals, and so on. So this is an addition in that direction. We conclude that an assessment of the multidimensional nature of adaptation is first practicable and secondly allows navigating along the adaptation-maladaptation continuum. This conceptualization prevents a narrow view of thinking in terms of immediate effectiveness and isolated responses. It highlights adaptation along pathways of responses that allow optimizing synergies, co-benefits and trade-offs and conflicts, ideally through multi-stakeholder decision-making, which you have emphasized throughout. We argue that there is value in establishing more generic guidance to support case study analysis and that way achieve some consistency in how adaptation and maladaptation is captured across contexts, for example, to feed into international processes such as the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. We have looked at the podcast on this, which requests governments to review the progress made in achieving the global goal on adaptation, CGA. We suggest every adaptation response should be assessed against the potential outcomes on ecosystems and ecosystem services, the climate in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation, and social system in terms of transformational potential, so that incremental adaptation, which keeps on bringing you more and more disasters, is avoided and transformational potential is fully accomplished. Finally, equity-related outcomes on low-income populations, women and girls, and marginalized ethnic groups. We urge adaptation decision makers and practitioners to accept responsibility and accountability for their actions, as we expect officials to be increasingly judged according to the outlined criteria by society. Well, those are good goals in terms of holding people accountable, but too many interests exist, knowledge gaps exist, handicaps exist in terms of adaptation capacity and availability of funding and knowledge, intellectual property rights, technology availability, and so on and so forth. So it's a complicated issue, but having a framework to navigate the adaptation-maladaptation continuum is going to be critical in terms of everything else we talked about for adaptation, in terms of mainstreaming it, incentivizing people and firms to take action, and protecting the poor and vulnerable. Okay, so I will leave this here. Again, I rushed through it a bit, but it's a nice paper that is worth reading, so you should go back and read it if you want to follow up.